Notification came at 11:52 p.m. on a Thursday. I wasn't supposed to be awake. I had a 6 a.m. alarm set for the next morning. We all did. My son's graduation ceremony at the University of Michigan started at 9, and my husband had promised we'd leave the house by 7 to beat the Ann Arbor traffic. I remember thinking, as I padded downstairs for a glass of water, that I should go straight back to bed. But I saw the glow of the iPad on the kitchen counter, and I made the mistake of picking it up. It was a Chase credit card notification, a purchase confirmation. The kind that shows up when you use the card abroad for the first time, and the bank wants to verify it's really you. The charge was for $340 at a restaurant called Nobu Tokyo, the one in Minato, not the one in Shinjuku. The notification had helpfully included, the card used was our joint card, the one we'd had since we got married 14 years ago. The name on the account was mine and my husband's. But my husband was supposed to be in Boston. He'd flown out 2 days earlier for what he called a critical pitch meeting with a private equity firm interested in acquiring his software company. He'd been building that company for 9 years. Of course they were interested. Of course it was critical. I'd packed his suitcase myself, smoothed the collar on his grey blazer, told him to text me when he landed. He'd texted me from Logan Airport. At least he'd texted me a photo of the Logan Airport departures board. I stood in my kitchen at 11:52 p.m., with the iPad in my hands and the refrigerator humming and a sound in my ears like water rushing. I read the notification 3 times. Then I opened our Chase app and scrolled through the transaction history. The Tokyo charge wasn't the first one. There was a hotel booking, the Peninsula Tokyo, 5 nights, checked in 2 days ago, $1,100 per night. There were 2 tickets on Japan Airlines, purchased 6 weeks earlier, Boston to Tokyo round trip. There were dinner charges, a spa charge, a charge at a jewelry store in the Ginza district that made my vision blur when I saw the amount. 2 tickets, 2 people. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, I didn't slide down a wall or anything like that. I just sat down because my legs felt like they'd forgotten what they were for. The tile was cold through my pajama pants. I could hear my son's bedroom door, upstairs, slightly open the way he still liked it, even at 22 when he was home from school. I could hear the clock on the microwave ticking. 14 years. I thought about whether I was misreading something. I tried, genuinely, to construct an explanation. Maybe my husband had a business contact in Tokyo. Maybe the pitch meeting had moved locations. Maybe he'd told me and I'd forgotten. I went through my texts. I went through my emails. I checked the family calendar app we used. Boston, it said. Pitch meeting, back Saturday. I didn't call him. I want to say that clearly. I didn't call him that night, didn't text, didn't do anything that would have let him know what I'd found. Something in me went very quiet and very focused, the way I imagine a surgeon feels when something unexpected happens mid-operation. You don't panic, you assess. I went back upstairs. I set my 6 a.m. alarm. I lay in bed next to my husband's empty side of the mattress, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me even then, I need to understand the full picture before I do anything. I fell asleep sometime after 3 a.m. In the morning, I made French toast. My son came downstairs in his cap and gown already, laughing at himself, saying he'd wanted to see if it still fit after the dry cleaner. It did. He looked exactly like his father at that age, which was something I'd always thought was sweet, and now I had to file away and not look at directly, the way you don't look at a bright light. His name is Kevin. He was graduating with a degree in computer science, magna cum laude, the first in my husband's family to get a graduate-level honors distinction. My husband had bragged about it to everyone at Thanksgiving. He printed Kevin's Dean's List letters and framed them. Kevin asked me if I'd heard from his dad. I said the flight from Boston sometimes ran late. Kevin nodded and poured himself coffee and talked about which of his friends were going to the ceremony and which were skipping straight to the party after, and I stood at the stove and flicked French toast and smiled and answered in the right places. My sister came at 8. Then my mother-in-law, which was its own specific kind of painful. She asked about her son. I said the same thing I told Kevin about the flight, and she accepted it because she always accepted what I told her. She trusted me. Sheep told me once, years ago, that I was the most organized person she'd ever met, and she meant it as a compliment. I think about that now. We drove to Ann Arbor in 2 cars. Kevin sat with his friends. I sat next to my mother-in-law, and my sister and I watched the Michigan countryside scroll by, and I thought about the peninsula Tokyo. The ceremony was beautiful. It genuinely was. Kevin walked across that stage with a composure that made me cry real tears. Not performance, not management, just actual maternal pride flooding through all the other things I was feeling. He found us in the crowd afterward and hugged me and said, quietly, "I really wanted Dad to see this." And I held on to him and said, "He knows how proud he is of you. He's told me that 100 times. Both of those things were true. My husband texted during the reception dinner, "How's my guy? Tell him I'm sorry I couldn't make it. Flight issues. Love to everyone." I showed the text to Kevin because it seemed like the right thing to do. Kevin smiled, a little tight around the eyes, and said, "Yeah, okay." Then he went back to his friends. I excused myself and went to the restaurant bathroom and sat in a stall for 4 minutes. Then I washed my hands, checked my face in the mirror, and went back to the table. On Sunday, while my husband was still theoretically in Boston, I called a friend of mine named Greta. Greta had gone through a divorce 3 years earlier, complicated, contentious, involving a business and significant assets, and she was the person who told me, unprompted, at a dinner party 2 years ago that if I ever needed a family law attorney, I should call the firm that had represented her. I hadn't asked why she'd said it. I'd changed the subject. But I'd kept the name of the firm in my phone. Greta answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't touch the accounts yet. Don't confront him yet. Write down everything you found with dates and amounts and call Rebecca Marsh first thing Monday morning." That was the attorney. I spent Sunday afternoon writing everything down. Every charge, every date, every amount. I went back through our joint card statements for the past 8 months. I'd always had full access. We'd kept everything transparent, which was its own particular irony, and I found things I'd noticed without registering. A hotel charge in Chicago I'd assumed was for a conference he'd mentioned. Dinner charges in cities he'd traveled to for work. A flight to San Francisco I couldn't account for at all. 8 months. At minimum. I also found the jewelry charge in Ginza was not the first jewelry charge. There had been one in April at a store in Chicago. $412. I didn't own anything new from April. I printed everything at the FedEx office down the road and put it in a folder in my car. My husband came home Sunday evening. He hugged me at the door. He smelled like airplane, and he said he was exhausted, and he asked how Kevin's graduation had been, and I told him it was wonderful, that Kevin had looked so grown up that my mother-in-law had cried through the whole ceremony. He said, "I hate that I missed it." He said it like he meant it. I made pasta for dinner. We watched television. He fell asleep on the couch by 9 o'clock. I sat next to him and watched him sleep and tried to find the man I'd married in his face, and I could, which was the strangest and most painful part of it. I met with Rebecca Marsh on Tuesday morning. She was direct and calm and made me feel immediately that I was not the first person to sit across her desk with a folder of printed credit card statements. She asked good questions. She explained my options clearly. She told me that Michigan was an equitable distribution state, which meant marital assets were divided fairly, but not necessarily equally, and that 14 years of marriage with significant shared assets, including my husband's company, which had been partially funded by money we'd earned together before he launched it, meant I had a meaningful position. She also told me something I hadn't known, that because my husband had used our joint credit card to fund what appeared to be a sustained extramarital relationship, that documentation was relevant and admissible. I asked her what I should do about the credit card. She told me not to cancel it yet, not to do anything that would signal I was preparing to act. Document everything. Keep a record. Don't confront him until we were ready. I asked her how long. She said, "Give me 2 weeks." I drove home from her office and I picked up a prescription and I stopped at the Kroger and I bought groceries and I made dinner and I asked my husband about his day and he told me about a new client they were onboarding and I listened and asked follow-up questions and nothing. in my face or my voice gave me away. I'd always been the composed one. In 14 years of marriage, he'd always come to me when something felt overwhelming. I was the one who thought clearly under pressure. He used to say it like a compliment. "You're so unshakable." He had no idea how right he was. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned things I hadn't let myself suspect. Rebecca's investigator, a retired police detective named Frank who wore khakis and spoke very softly, confirmed that the woman on the Tokyo trip was someone my husband had hired at his company 18 months earlier. She was 31. She ran their West Coast partnerships. He'd told me about her exactly once in passing, and I'd had no reason to think anything of it. I want to be honest about what that specific detail did to me, not the age difference, not the professional relationship, though both of those stung in particular ways. What undid me briefly was the realization that she'd been in rooms where I'd been present. At the company holiday party last December, the one I'd helped organize, the one where I'd stood next to my husband and shaken hands with his employees and brought homemade gingerbread, she had been there. He had introduced us. I had told her I liked her earrings. I took a walk around the block and I let myself feel that for exactly the length of the walk. Then I came home and I watered the plants and I called my sister. My sister, to her enormous credit, did not say anything dramatic or satisfying. She just said, "What do you need from me right now?" And I said, "Nothing yet, just no." And she said, "I know, I'm here." That was enough. The second thing the investigation turned up was more significant from Rebecca's perspective. My husband had, 6 months earlier, begun transferring funds from the company's operating account into a separate account in his name only. Small amounts at first, then larger. He appeared to be preparing for something, a buyout, Rebecca speculated, or perhaps a restructuring of ownership. The company had been valued the previous year at $4.2 million. My name was not on any of the company documents, but the initial capitalization, the money he'd used to launch it 9 years ago, had come in part from a joint savings account and in part from an inheritance I'd received from my grandfather. Rebecca said carefully that this was a conversation worth having with a financial forensics expert. I hired one. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after I'd found the Chase notification, my husband sat down across from me at our kitchen table and told me he had something to tell me. I remember the way he cleared his throat first, the way he put his hands flat on the table like he was bracing himself. He'd clearly rehearsed some version of this, and I remember thinking with a strange detachment that whatever he'd rehearsed was going to be the stripped-down version, the version designed to minimize. He told me he'd made a serious mistake. He told me there had been someone, that it was over now, that he'd ended it in Tokyo. And I noticed he didn't realize he'd just confirmed Tokyo, and that he was prepared to do whatever it took to fix our marriage. He didn't say her name. He didn't say how long. He said, "Serious mistake" twice, and "I love you" once, and "our family" 3 times. I let him finish. Then I said, "I know about Tokyo. I know about Chicago. I know about the flight to San Francisco in February. I know about the jewelry in April." I watched his face go through several things in quick succession. I also know about the transfers from the operating account, and I've spoken with an attorney. The kitchen was very quiet. He said my name. Just my name, the way you'd say it if you'd been grabbed from behind unexpectedly. I said, "I'm not interested in fixing the marriage. I've thought about it carefully and I want a divorce. Rebecca Marsh is representing me. You'll be hearing from her office this week." He started to say something and I held up one hand, not unkindly, and said, "I don't want to have this conversation tonight. Kevin is coming home this weekend, and I'd like us to behave like adults until we've had time to tell him together, the way he deserves." My husband looked at me for a long moment. He said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. Kevin took it hard. Of course he did. He's 22 and he loves both his parents, and he'd grown up in what he thought was a stable home. I don't have any way to make that easier for him, and I've stopped trying to pretend I do. What I can do is be honest with him, within reason, and be consistent and be present, and I focused on those things. He asked me once, a few weeks after we told him, if I was angry. I thought about it honestly before answering. I said, "Yes." But anger isn't what's driving me. He asked what was. I said, clarity. The divorce took 7 months. It was not simple and it was not cheap, and there were stretches of it that were genuinely exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not dramatic or explosive, just grinding, the way any long, complicated process grinds on you. There were depositions and financial disclosures and several conversations between attorneys that I was not in the room for and had to hear about secondhand. The company valuation was contested, as Rebecca had told me it would be. My husband's lawyers argued that his 9 years of work had built the company's value and that my initial contribution was negligible in proportion. Rebecca's financial forensics expert argued otherwise. The inheritance from my grandfather, the joint savings that had funded the early operating costs, my years of managing our household finances while my husband poured his energy into the company, all of it was documented, quantified, argued. We settled for an amount I'm not going to share publicly, but I will say that it was fair. Rebecca told me it was more than she'd expected given how the early valuations looked. I'll take that. The woman from his company, I eventually learned her name, though I won't use it here, left the company 4 months after the Tokyo trip. I don't know what happened between them after my husband came home and our marriage formally ended. I don't particularly need to know. What I heard, through someone who still works there, is that she accepted a position at a competitor, and my husband didn't take it well. That's all I know and all I want to know. What I do know is that 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my husband called me and said he'd made the worst mistake of his life and asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation. I told him I wished him well. I told him I meant that sincerely, and I said no. I'm writing this from a condo I bought in Grand Rapids. It's on the 3rd floor, which I love. I can see a stretch of the Grand River from the bedroom window if the angle is right. I have plants everywhere, which my husband had always mildly discouraged because he said they made the house look cluttered. I have a reading chair that is genuinely the most comfortable piece of furniture I've ever owned. I have dinner with my sister on Thursdays. Kevin visited last month. We made homemade pizza and watched a movie, and he slept on the pull-out couch, and in the morning I made French toast, same recipe I've made since he was 6, and he said it tasted exactly the same as always, and I said, it is exactly the same. He seemed like he needed to hear that. That some things don't change. I'm not going to tell you I feel only gratitude and peace because that would be dishonest. Some mornings I wake up and the grief is right there, immediate, before I even fully remember why, 14 years of a life I believed in. That's real and I won't pretend it isn't. But I'll tell you what I didn't expect. I didn't expect to feel, underneath everything else, something that functions a lot like relief. Not because the marriage ended, but because I know, with a certainty I can't fully explain, that I handled it exactly the way I needed to handle it. I didn't collapse. I didn't chase. I didn't beg for an explanation or a confession or an apology that would have been shaped entirely by what he thought I needed to hear. I assessed. I prepared. I acted when I was ready. My mother-in-law still calls me once a month. She says she doesn't blame me, and I believe her. And I try to be warm because she's a good person who loves her son and also loves Kevin, and those things matter. The night before I closed on the Grand Rapids condo, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the title company and I called Greta. I told her where I was and why, and she laughed, a real warm, startled laugh, and she said, "Look at you." And I said, "Look at me. I don't know what comes next. I'm not in a hurry to figure it out. For the first time in a very long time, the life I'm living is entirely mine to shape, and I find that I'd like to take my time with it." The river is beautiful in the mornings, by the way. I watch it while the coffee brews every day. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected a lot of things, and somehow that turned out to be fine. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled it, if I wish I'd confronted him sooner or screamed or fallen apart the way maybe I was supposed to, and I tell them honestly, no, not for a single day. I think there's something most people misunderstand about situations like mine. They expect the story to be about anger, and anger was there. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But anger is loud, and anger is fast, and anger is fast, and anger, if you let it drive, will steer you straight into a wall. What actually got me through wasn't fury. It was something quieter, something I had to choose repeatedly every morning for 7 months to keep holding on to. I've thought a lot about what my husband actually lost when he made those choices. Not just the marriage, not just the settlement, not just the company stake he thought was fully his. He lost the version of himself that Kevin looked up to. He lost his mother's uncomplicated pride in him. He lost 14 years of a partnership with someone who had genuinely, fully believed in him. And I did believe in him. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. The loss wasn't a small thing on my side, and it wasn't a small thing on his, and I think he knows that now in a way he didn't when he was booking flights to Tokyo on our joint card. There's a kind of accounting that happens in a life. Not overnight, not in any single dramatic moment, but over time, the things you do and the things you don't do add up. My husband spent years building something real and then spent 8 months quietly dismantling his own foundation without seeming to understand that's what he was doing. The woman he chose instead, she left his company 4 months later. She moved on. He was left with what his choices had actually built, which turned out to be considerably less than he'd imagined. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because I think it's true, and I think it's worth saying. The consequences of how we treat people don't usually announce themselves. They accumulate. They show up later in forms we didn't anticipate. What I learned about myself in those 7 months is something I wouldn't trade. I learned that I could hold something enormously painful and still function, still make French toast, still sit next to my mother-in-law at Kevin's graduation and be fully present for my son, still make clear-eyed decisions about my own future without letting grief make them for me. That's not coldness. I want to be specific about that because I know it can look like coldness from the outside. It's something closer to the decision to remain yourself when everything around you is trying to reshape you into someone smaller. Kevin told me recently that watching how I handled it taught him something he couldn't have gotten any other way. He said he didn't have the words for it exactly. I told him he didn't need to. Some things you carry forward without being able to name them, and that's fine. That might even be better. The river outside my window in Grand Rapids is steady every morning regardless of what happened the day before. I find that genuinely comforting, not because it means nothing matters. It all mattered, every bit of it, but because it means the world continues, and so do I, and there is real work still ahead worth showing up for. That's enough. That has always been enough.